Support comes from Gemma, architects, planners, and designers seeking to bring joy to their clients and communities. Details at gemastl.com.
This is St. Louis on the Air from St. Louis Public Radio. I'm Elaine Cha. In Missouri, the parole system is due for a makeover. Its rules, which haven't been updated since 2017, govern the lives of more than 52,000 people, more than twice the number in the state's prisons. But according to those who work inside that system, the process is often confusing, complicated, and broken. Change could be coming. Under an executive order signed by Governor Mike Kehoe early this year, a special working group has been meeting to address the problems in the state's system for parole. The members of this working group include various officials, like the chairman of the parole board and the director of the Department of Corrections. It also includes people who have experienced this system from different sides. And joining me now are three members of that working group. Kim Bashir is the victim's advocate with the Cole County Prosecutor's Office. Kim, welcome to the show.
Thanks.
We also have Stacy Leonard, who is a public defender and the founder of the nonprofit Healing Sisters. Stacy spent nearly 2 decades of her life in prison for a violent crime. In 2009, her sentence was commuted by Missouri Governor Matt Blunt. Stacy, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
And also with us is Courtney Everett, the coordinator for St. Louis University's Prison Education Program. He is a graduate of that program, having previously spent about 20 years in prison for a violent crime. He completed his sentence and was granted parole. Courtney, thank you for being here too.
Thank you for having me.
Now, all three of you have had different experiences in Missouri's parole system. And Stacy and Courtney, both of you, in your younger lives, spent many years incarcerated. And Kim, you've spent many years working in victim services, including in Missouri's prison system. Courtney, I want to start with you. Parole can be a very different process depending on each case. Now, you went through a parole hearing here in Missouri. How was it that played out for you at that time?
So I was sentenced to the Department of Correction in 2004. And so my first month of incarceration, they gave me a letter saying that I was eligible for parole in 2019. And my only instructions was to take a 6-week anger management class. Mm-hmm. So that was the only information I had to prepare myself for release to society. Mm-hmm. I was notified in 2017 that my hearing was upcoming. And so when I went to my hearing in 2019, it was basically, at that time, I was probably 6 credits away from my second college degree. I had had no major, conduct violations. So my parole hearing really was just a process of me listening to the parole officers. They really didn't ask me any questions because based on their standards, I was overqualified.
And Stacy, in your personal justice system experience, you did not come up for parole because your original sentence did not include that possibility. And we're pointing that out now so that folks understand that you yourself did not go through the parole process, that you did not face a parole board. But you have seen that process as a public defender, and you actually lead teams that defend people who are facing the possibility of losing their parole. How does that situation, potential loss of parole, come about?
So it's called a parole revocation, and people face having their parole revoked when they receive violations from their parole officer. Probation and parole officers are the same entity, so a person being supervised by the Missouri Department of Probation and Parole could be either on probation or on parole. But they could receive a violation. There's like 11 different violations that a person could face. One of them is a new laws violation. Another one could be not reporting on time or changing residency. So they've got a blue book. They've got a book out that lists the 11 different violation types.
Mm-hmm. And what is it that happens if a person does have their parole revoked, I mean, is there a process by which they can appeal?
No, no. So Missouri's parole process is a little different than what people usually see on TV. Like when you think of somebody going in front of the parole board or facing a parole revocation, you picture them going in front of the entire parole board, all 7 people. And that doesn't actually happen in Missouri. In Missouri, they use what's called hearing panels. So that's comprised of 3 people, 1 parole board member, 1 institutional parole officer, and 1 hearing panel officer.
And Courtney, I believe that is kind of what you described, right? For you, your release on parole happened in 2021. What kinds of conditions did you have to live up to? You know, what were the sorts of supervision that you had to deal with?
None. What Stacy just described is what I think is the most important part of the process. She said there are 11 types of violations. There aren't any conditions for success. I was released from prison with 2 college degrees, and when I went into my parole hearing, I had resumes. I had the ability to get a job, so there wasn't anything that they can do for me. Because their definition of success is don't reoffend, find housing, find employment, and don't commit a crime. I wasn't a risk for any of those things, so my supervision was minimum from the start. My only requirement was to pay $30 a month.
So this don't reoffend approach that Courtney has described, Stacy, when you're working with clients, I mean, how do you talk with them about this?
So we only represent clients that are facing parole revocations. That's what we do. I'm part of the parole revocation defense team. So it's mainly what happened. Are there any mitigating circumstances as to why this issue happened? Is there something that makes this violation unjust? Is there something that we can explain? So that's really the conversations that we have with our clients.
Kim, for your part, you know, the parole system, it does understandably focus on the offender, but many crimes involve victims who have an interest in the status of a person who harmed them. So where is it that victims come into play in the parole process? I mean, do they come into play at all?
They do, in that there is a victims' rights statute that lines out some significant steps that the parole board has to follow as far as informing victims, how hearings are set up. So, for example, any dangerous felony in the state of Missouri, DOC is required to register those victims for notifications of parole hearings. The other right that they have is to have good notification, or enough notification so that they might make arrangements to come. So they have to have at least 30 days notification prior to the hearing date.
Another part of the experience that you have, Kim, is that you worked as a probation and parole officer for almost 30 years. What is it that stands out to you about that experience, especially given that you're now part of this group looking at changing the system and, you know, with what you are hearing and experiencing with victims?
Well, my 27 years out in the field, I very much enjoyed working with probation and parolees. But that system is also made up of people, and not everyone is going to perform their job in a way that I would find acceptable. And so you have situations where you'll have a person who's on parole and they will have great success because they have an officer that understands what success is. And then you can have that same person move to a different officer and experience a completely different situation where they're not having success, and that could be because of the role of the officer. So that can at times, I understand, be difficult. but I personally felt like, I've watched the Department of Corrections move from one place to another. And especially in the last years where I was working in the victims unit for the Department of Corrections, there was a real huge change on presentation, which I think was detrimental to relationship building with probation and parolees, where you saw a probation and parole officer was very much being presented as a law enforcement officer. And when you're trying to build rapport with people who have been in the system, that can sometimes set up a barrier right off the bat, which can be hard to overcome. So I really struggle with that change that they decided to make.
Courtney, you have something to jump in
Just
here.
thinking about what Kim was saying. Like, I don't want to oversimplify my process, but from my own personal experience and experience of others, the reason the parole process was so simple for me is because of my relationship with the parole officer. She kind of recognized where I was mentally, emotionally, and so she kind of gave me leniency, because out of the 11 types of violations that Stacey talked about, I probably broke a few, just being human, and but I wasn't punished for those. But one of the things that did happen because of their policies, like my parole officer had to visit my home and my job in a bulletproof vest with a gun, and which is very intimidating and embarrassing to be standing in your front yard with 2 law enforcement officers standing in front of you when you're just trying to do the right thing. But because of her approach to her job, she didn't come to my job because she didn't want to embarrass me because of the type of job that I had.
And that occurs to me as an approach that would help a person live, successfully outside prison after having served a sentence. I mean, Kim, had you been, lenient, and what sorts of judgment calls are you at discretion to make if you are a parole officer?
That is really difficult, honestly, for me to address at this point, because I haven't been working out in the field situation for 10, 15 years. At the time that I was out there, most of your technical violations could be discretionary outside of drug use, weapons. But say you moved your residence and you didn't let your probation parole officer know within the prescribed amount of time, that I could make that decision. Let's say it took you a week. I could decide to write a violation or not, depending on what your history was, depending on, other factors. If you changed jobs without telling me. So there are certain violations that you had discretion on whether or not you wanted to write that violation. Now, I will add to that, and I'm trying to be fair on both sides, that if you committed a violation, many times you would see a non-discretionary violation written up, but there would be, like, for the lack of a better way to say it, stacking of violations that were discretionary. Oh, so I can hit them with, they left the area. That's a travel violation. I can hit, and so that was always very difficult for me, because if that's a discretionary violation that you wouldn't have written outside of any other circumstance, then it shouldn't be piled on to make this non-discretionary violation appear worse than it is.
Stacey, you're nodding your head.
Yes, because when somebody faces revocation, then there's a whole slew of violations that come with it. And it might be something as simple as intervention fees. And, to me, sometimes, why are we dealing with these smaller violations when we have something much larger that we need to deal with and talk about?
We need to take a quick break here, but when we come back, we'll continue this conversation about Missouri's parole system and explore its problems. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio.
This is St. Louis Public Radio. Support comes from Perrick Corporation, a contractor with over 4 decades of shaping the St. Louis landscape. More at perrick.com.
Welcome back. I'm Elaine Cha. We're spending today's show with 3 members of a special working group, one that's taken up the difficult task of improving the state's parole system. And I'm here with Stacy Leonard, a Missouri public defender, Courtney Everett, the coordinator for St. Louis University's Prison Education Program, and Kim Bashir, who is the victim's advocate with the Cole County Prosecutor's Office. Before the break, we were talking about the parole board, what is involved, what the parole process is like. But I want to make sure that we get to this working group. And all 3 of you are members of Governor Mike Kehoe's parole system working group. And the goal of this group is to deliver recommendations to the governor for improving this system, which has not been changed since 2017. Now, you all began meeting last month. What is your impression, Stacy, of this effort so far?
I think people really want what's best for Missouri. There's a huge push right now for truth in sentencing, and that means when someone's sentenced to 5 years in the Department of Corrections, they do 5 years in the Department of Corrections. Mm-hmm. So there's that lack of taking into account that parole was created to make sure that a person is living a law-abiding life. Mm-hmm. Right? When a person goes to the Department of Corrections, the majority of people are coming back out on parole. So how do we help them return back to society to be a beneficial citizen? Mm-hmm. And parole helps with that.
Courtney, what has your impression been?
My impression is similar to what Stacy just mentioned, but outside of this group, I've had a working relationship with the Department of Corrections for the last 3 years. I've been on some panels and things with the director and other members. And as Stacy said, they clearly recognize that the way the system is developed right now isn't working, mm-hmm. and they want to change. My impression of the group is, my first impression was I was very nervous because it seems like a really conservative group. It seems like really law enforcement or DOC heavy. Mm-hmm. So I was really concerned about their backgrounds and their perspective. But it seems like, as Stacy said, everybody wants to change, but everyone comes from a similar background. So I'm really concerned at how that works.
Mm-hmm. Now, Kim, you're working and have worked on different sides of this. Is the system not working? Do you agree with that?
The system, what I want to comment on really has to do with the goal of the work group, and part of that is what Stacy referred to as truth in sentencing. That part of the way the parole board works is quite confusing, and that is not necessarily the fault of the parole board, but just different sentencing laws in the state of Missouri. Mm-hmm. Your scenarios become so confusing that a prosecutor, a defense attorney, a defendant, a victim have very little understanding of what a sentence means in the state of Missouri. There are so many factors that go into the determination of the minimum release date. It is like it's like an algebra problem on such a high level because there are so many considerations. I think if there were a way to simplify that so that when you get, say, a plea offer, you can have an intelligent conversation and actually understand what that truly means, aside from your basic 85%ers. On like dangerous felonies, you have to serve 85% of your sentence. The other part of that is that sometimes you have a person who's been down to DOC several times. Well, that completely changes. Is this a 50% charge now because you've been down several times? Is it an 80%er? And defense attorneys nor prosecutors can always understand that. And so they're not always very clear on, well, what does this really mean for the person that is being sentenced?
So, Stacy, you've been nodding your head. Truth in sentencing is often brought up in criticism of the parole process. You mentioned it earlier, but what does that phrase mean to you?
So truth in sentencing means that when a person's sentenced, that all the players involved, the defense attorney, the prosecution, the judge, the defendant, the victim, the defendant's family, that they know when that person walks in the Department of Corrections doors when they're going to walk out. And in Missouri, we don't have that. In Missouri, it's completely discretionary. Some states actually do have truth in sentencing. They do have mandatory times that people have to serve. But in Missouri, it's dependent on what the person was convicted of, how many times they've been incarcerated previously, how many times they've been arrested, what their neighborhood looks like, what their socioeconomic status is. It's a wide range of factors that the parole board takes into account, and that the legislature has created these different statutes around how much time this person has to serve. Mm-hmm. So it's what's called the Blue Book, and it has appendices for the different crimes. And there are probably at least 17 different guidelines that create the eligibility dates for somebody facing parole.
Mm-hmm. This working group you convened for the first time on June 13th, and this was a listening session with public comment. One of the comments came from Clifton Davis, the founder of Primrose Path Legal Services in Columbia.
The first issue I would like to raise before you is delayed releases after parole is granted. One of the most painful realities for many incarcerated individuals and their families is being granted parole only to learn that their actual release is still years away. Some wait 2, 3, even 5 years after being granted parole. In that moment, the hope that parole represents starts to feel more like a holding pattern than a second chance.
And that was Clifton Davis speaking at a public meeting of the Parole Working Group last month. Courtney, you were nodding also, and clearly there are some feelings that you have.
Yes, it's not only from my personal experience, but my professional relationships. And so you're sentenced to incarceration in a court of law, but your parole hearing is a behavioral analysis. So like in my case, I was sentenced to prison in 2004. I had a parole hearing in 2019, which I was considered a dangerous felon. I can only be released at 85% after serving 85% of my time. So at my hearing, I was told that I'm eligible for parole, my parole is granted, but I can't be released from prison for another 2.5 years, which in my mind is essentially another prison sentence, because the only thing I can do from the date of my hearing to the date of my release from prison is a behavioral violation that would get my parole date taken from me.
So in effect, what does that do? I mean, 2 years is a long time.
2 years is a prison sentence. And it leads to kind of a form of depression because you have all this hope and this anxiety that this period of your life is over, then you can move forward, but you really can't because now you have to spend that period of time essentially, for lack of a better term, walking on eggshells, because the only thing that can happen to you from those in between those dates is to make your situation worse. Mm-hmm. There's no classes, there are no programmings, there's nothing that you can do to expedite the process. And so you've been told that you're ready to be released from prison, but you can't go.
Mm-hmm. And
can I address something?
Sure, Kim.
Okay, I'm sorry. That was a recognition by the parole board, and that was changing as I was retiring. So there was this thought process that, we'll have this parole hearing 2 years before they're supposed to get out or get, a release date. And Courtney brings up a very valid point that I struggled with. And what we'll do is tell them what they need to do in order to be released. And that was always so counterintuitive for me, because you can only tell release if you've done all those programming steps to show that you're ready to be released. And so as I was leaving and retiring, they were changing that process so that you would be having a parole hearing about 4 months prior to your minimum eligibility date. And at that hearing, they were supposed to be looking at what programming have you involved yourself in to get yourself ready for release. Because they understood what is the benefit of having people in prison for years and then telling them 2 years before they're supposed to leave, this is what you need to get done. And to motivate people on their own to seek out programming and to build up, quote unquote, their prison resume to show that they're ready for release in the community.
And so this is supposed to address everyone generally, not people on an individual basis. Is that right?
I would not say that's correct. Part of the process when someone comes into prison is basically a needs assessment. And that means when that person comes in, they're interviewed and their needs are supposed to be assessed as to what can we do to meet whatever your need is, and provide them with the information on what programming and what is available within the Department of Corrections to address those needs. So it is individual in the sense that not everybody's going to have the same needs. It is not individual in as much as everybody is going to be scheduled for a parole hearing about 4 months prior to the release.
Mm-hmm. And before we leave this point, Stacy, in your working with clients who are looking at parole revocation, how much of that programming and the individualized kind of approach, if we can call it that, how much of that has been addressed? I mean, is that related to some of the reasons people are looking at revocation potentially of their parole?
Yes, because when people are released on parole, they do a needs assessment to look at what the person needs to be successful on parole. So, for example, if somebody's released and prior to incarceration, they had a substance use disorder, they might order a substance use disorder assessment upon their release. Well, that assessment can cost anywhere up to like $350. So you've got somebody who just came home. How can they afford to pay for the assessment? And then when they don't do it, then it leads to a violation, which could lead to a revocation. Mm-hmm. So the needs assessments are tied to a bunch of fees that should be eliminated.
Mm-hmm. We need to take a quick break here, but we will be back shortly to continue this conversation about the state of the parole system in Missouri and an official effort that is underway to improve it. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio.
If you have a smart speaker, you have access to the entire world of NPR and St. Louis Public Radio. All the latest news and all the captivating stories. Activate our voices with yours by telling your smart speaker to play St. Louis Public Radio.
Welcome back. We're spending our entire show today learning about something that's often unseen in Missouri despite its reach, the state system of parole. That system, which oversees more than 50,000 people, is currently the subject of an official working group that's trying to make recommendations for update, something that hasn't happened since 2017. And I'm here with 3 members of that working group. Courtney Everett is the coordinator for St. Louis University's Prison Education Program. Kim Bashir is the victim's advocate with the Cole County Prosecutor's Office, and Stacy Lannert is a Missouri public defender. Now, before the break, we were talking about the challenges people face in the parole program. It is a very stressful process. It takes a long time, and a single mistake can undo years of work. Now, Courtney, you are in regular contact with people who are incarcerated. What is it that stands out to you about how they experience the parole process?
I think the biggest thing that stands out is that there's no measure or definition of success. I think it's just attributed to the overall narrative around crime and incarceration. It's that the people that we incarcerate are broken and need to be fixed. And the solution to their problems is just to behave differently. But for people who are incarcerated, there is no standard on what they need to be or do to shorten their prison time. Like earlier, we talked about a needs assessment, but the Department of Corrections only assesses needs that they view they can solve. So if you're convicted of a violent crime, you have an anger problem. So take anger management. If you have a drug crime, you need AA or NA. That's as far as they can go when diagnosing any type of problems that lead to incarceration.
How is it then, that people deal with, how much time it takes for the process, to get them to the point of seeing, or getting to the parole hearing, and then years later, actually getting out?
The system is kind of this cookie cutter process where, everyone is treated as this monogamous group, but how people deal with it is based on the individual. The things that you see and hear about the prison system, about incarceration, about recidivism is many times people who can't deal with it in a healthy manner. You deal with it by internalizing anger, suffering from depression. You try to find coping mechanisms that are often unhealthy with violence, drugs that are incarcerated, sex, things that you kind of do to cope. The average person incarcerated they deal with it by internalizing their pain, because the narrative around incarceration in prison is that, specifically for men, you're not allowed to be emotional. You're not allowed to communicate. And because the system is what it is, you're not allowed to have personal relationships. So unless a person finds a higher power in God, they seek education or joins a productive community, the average person deals with it in a negative way.
On that point of pain, I want to make sure that we also acknowledge that with the parole process, there are those who are outside the prison who are involved in this, and that is victims of crimes. Now, Kim, I imagine that there are situations in which a crime victim may want the person who harmed them to stay in prison as long as possible or forever. How is it that you approach cases like that? Is there something that you tell victims or talk with them about who feel that way?
When you have a victim that feels that way, and it is very common, they also, though, have a reality. I want them to stay in prison as long as they can. I want them to stay in prison for the rest of their lives. But we talk about the reality of the system. This is what it looks like. This is what you can do and what you can control. And quite honestly, and when I say this, I mean no offense, it is called a criminal justice system, not a victim justice system. And the victims are thrown into this many times without any active participation of their own. And it can be very frustrating and very confusing, and it causes a great deal of anger. And then all that anger then gets placed directly on whoever committed the crime against them. And you talk about the needs of the people who commit the crimes. There are many needs that our victims have that there is no process that carries them through addressing those needs. As a county-wide victim advocate, at this point, I'm trying to get them involved in counseling and get them to resources that can help them. Again, the same thing that Stacy brought up. Those are very expensive resources, and very rarely do my victims have the wherewithal to pay for that. And so that increases the anger. Now, I will say, I have been very, very much trying to get my victims to utilize the Crime Victims Compensation Fund, and that is an awesome resource. However, it is only available to them for 3 years after the crime. And when that is the case, I think we can all agree that certain traumas, most traumas, are going to take more than 3 years to process through. So although initially they will get resources, as they transition, as they're maybe going through the parole process, they have no kind of resources that the parole board can offer, or the Office of Victim Services, who serves victims in DOC, to offer. These people move on with their lives, and sometimes out of nowhere they'll get a notice that there's a parole hearing coming up, and the parole hearing notices usually go out about 60 days. And so for 60 days, they are doing nothing but reliving the trauma that they experienced that got them to the point where they need to attend a parole hearing. Mm-hmm. And so it is a very difficult issue. And typically, the only thing that we could do is to listen and to validate that what they were feeling was perfectly acceptable to where they were. And so the system, it fails on both sides of it.
Is there something in particular that victims are asking for when it comes to what is happening with this working group, Kim?
Victims want to understand the sentencing process. Victims want to know more about the parole process, because in what Courtney and Stacy have described, that people within the prison experience at a parole hearing, the victim experiences the same thing. Number one, I cannot share with a victim, and this was a regular question when I was working at DOC, what has this person done to improve themselves in prison? I'm sorry, I can't share that with you because that is confidential information. It's protected. And so these victims would definitely want to take that into consideration. I would say the majority of victims were not interested in having this person spend any more time incarcerated than they needed to or should have to. Mm-hmm. But they wanted to also, they would err, in their opinion, on the side of caution. If I don't know that this person has done anything, then my statement to the parole board is going to be based on the fact that they didn't do anything. There's also this complete chasm that is created between a defendant or an offender and the victim. There's nothing that is healing for either party about this process. And that I think is one of the biggest things that we would hear at DOC. I don't hear that as a county-wide advocate because they're still so close to the event that they're not in a position to maybe be open to that. Mm-hmm. But we heard that a lot when I was in the Department of Corrections, and I heard that from both sides since I have been on both sides. And I would even go down to the institutions, any of their programs, and meet with different offenders who were incarcerated and have conversations. And very frequently I would hear about, it would be really great if we could talk to our victim, or if we could send a letter to our victim. And so I think that would go a long way on both sides to address a lot of the trauma that both sides are experiencing as a result of the crime.
Mm-hmm. Now, the first meeting of the working group that all three of you are part of, again, was on June 13th, and it opened with remarks from the chairman of the Missouri Parole Board, Tony Helfrich.
This is a once-in-a-decade opportunity to delve into the Missouri Parole Board's existing guidelines and processes and to refine its approach to offender management and increase accountability for those decisions, with the goal of safeguarding public safety while promoting successful reintegration and reducing recidivism.
That was Missouri Parole Board Chairman Tony Helfrich speaking at last month's opening meeting of a working group that's currently reviewing Missouri's parole system. Helfrich called this a once-in-a-decade opportunity. What opportunities do you see in this process so far, Stacy?
I think that we're being heard. We're definitely being able to tell the working group like where we would like to see change. We're listening to other people, and we're bringing those thoughts to the board and to this working group. And there is really good feedback. There are people on the other sides of the aisle who don't necessarily have the same point of view as I do, but everybody's listening, and they'll take into account the other person's point of view. So for me, one of the biggest things that I would like changed is the household definition based around fees. And one of the sheriffs who's on the working group, he absolutely agreed with that. Why are we taking into account an entire household's economic status instead of this parolee's economic status when it comes to paying these fees? Mm-hmm. So, we don't want to create debtors' prisons. And the sheriff definitely, they're expressing their point of views, they're being transparent, and everybody's really just trying to find common ground.
Mm-hmm. Courtney, how about you? I mean, as far as the opportunities, what are your hopes for this working group?
I just would echo everything that Stacy said. My hope is that that all sides are represented. I will go back to what Kim just talked about from a victim's perspective. It's like when we talk about incarceration and crime, we have this movie perspective that there's a good guy and a bad guy, and the rest of us are qualified to make the decisions what happens. Mm-hmm. So what I hope for in this working group is that all sides are heard. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, there will be crimes committed this evening, but this idea that we have millions of citizens who are just waiting for the sun to go down so they can act out is not accurate. There are cultural issues, there are systemic issues, there are mental health and family dynamics that aren't considered when people commit crimes. So I just hope for an opportunity to represent all sides of the conversation and humanize the process.
Kim, as far as success goes, and Courtney, you've mentioned that measures of success are not given, it's only by violation. How will you know, Kim, that this work that you're doing with the working group is a success?
I think if we are looking at more transparency, that a victim can understand the process, that a victim is not treated as though they're not a consideration or treated as though they are an afterthought. I experienced that in both my role as a county advocate, and I experienced that in my role as the coordinator of the Office of Victim Services at DOC. There were many times when I would have arguments about things regarding victim rights that are written in statute that I would really have to push. Out in the community, I see that on a regular basis. Judges do not always abide by the victim's statute or what is written in the Constitution, which is essentially a mirror of the victim statute. So they don't follow the law and the Missouri Constitution. I would like to see the parole hearing process opened up and have it be more public. I know that we have victims who are not able to attend parole hearings because it is a financial burden, and there is no way for them to attend unless they physically appear. And you can't do it by video, although everyone else in the process can do that. They aren't able to because they don't know if it's being kept confidential on the victim's end. And there has been no brainstorming as to, well, how can we make this more accessible to them? And there is probation and parole offices all over this state that I think they should be utilizing to allow victims to come to their closest place that they can to be part of this process.
Mm-hmm. When we opened this conversation, we described the parole process in this system as one that's confusing, it's complicated, it is broken, and it seems that all three of you agree on that. But I want to give you space to respond to one final question, and that is, why is what we've been discussing something that you feel is important for all people to understand? And Stacey, I'd like to start with you.
When we talk about parole and supervision, people rarely think about it unless it affects their families, right? But it actually affects every resident of the state because the state is putting money into incarceration and into supervision. And 9 times out of 10, that person is going to be returned to the community. And what type of person would we like to see return to that community? Recidivism usually doesn't happen until the 3rd or 5th year of supervision. It doesn't happen immediately. Mm-hmm. So that's showing that something isn't quite right. And how can we change this from a punishment-based system to recognizing the trauma involved and helping heal?
Stace, Kim?
I would echo what Stacey is saying and what Courtney had alluded to before. The reality is this is not a black and white system. And my victims have also been defendants. This is a system that is going to impact so many citizens that don't even realize it is part of their life. And I think that is the most important thing to consider, is how can we better this system for everyone in the state of Missouri. And that is the hope of having all these different entities coming together instead of us standing in our corners and saying, or in our silos and saying, this is what's best for my victim. This is what's best for, and that's what I am very much hoping to see. And I believe we're headed in the right direction, but it is a very long road.
Mm-hmm. And Courtney, what do all people need to know about this?
I would just echo what Stacey and Kim said. As they both said, the system isn't black or white, and I would also say that people aren't either. We all want the same thing, and when we talk about public safety, we all have a shared humanity. The problems that we have in our communities aren't limited to 50,000 people. Drugs, violence, gangs, weapons, they're bigger than a handful of people, and removing people hasn't solved the problem. So I'm a firm believer that those who are closest to the problem are closest to the solution. So if we can empower people who've gone through the system to go back into the communities and kind of be solutions to the problems, kind of like antibodies in a cancerous system, we all have a better world to live in.
Courtney Everett is the coordinator for St. Louis University's Prison Education Program. Kim Bashir is the victim's advocate for the Cole County Prosecutor's Office. And Stacey Lanner is a Missouri public defender. Thank you, all of you, for making time to talk with us today.
Thank you for having us.
This episode was produced by Danny Wissentowski.
Audio engineering and podcast design by Aaron Dorr.
Our executive producer is Alex Hoyer.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations, and leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thank you.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
The Gateway brings you the day's news each weekday from around the St. Louis region and the state capitals in Jefferson City.
Our schools are accredited. We don't need this bill.
And Springfield.
How many more years must pass before lawmakers see time is of the essence?
I'm Abby Larico. Join me each weekday for The Gateway on the STLPR app or wherever you get podcasts.